morning. Enter and rejoice and come in. We're so glad that you are all here. And how many are out on Zoom?
9.
9 out on Zoom. So that helps. Okay. I'm Becky Tanner, and I will be the facilitator for today's service. Prior to the beginning of the service, if you have an announcement, there are forms to fill out back behind Richard back there. And also if you have a joy or sorrow, there's another little paper to fill out if you want to put that on there, and somebody will bring them forward to me. Okay, I have a few announcements here, but the first one has to be turn off your phones if you haven't already done so, so that we don't have little noises going off. All right. At 1 o'clock today, we will have the Free Thinkers, and they meet here. Roland will be the leader of that group. And Jeannie has an announcement that if you need a name tag like this, instead of the little stickers, see her after the service, and she will do beautiful calligraphy and make you a name tag. She'll be out in the Sunday school room in the back. Another announcement is on Friday, there will be board games from 1 to 3. We've done this one time. It was real fun. They played mahjong and
some silly, really fun games.
Yeah, some silly, really fun games that kind of get a little edgy, if I remember right.
A little more than edgy, almost obscene. But
Yes, almost obscene, but I didn't want to say that word up here. Okay, so now that we have everyone in here, if you will sit quietly as Jean plays her prelude. Very short, she says. Thank you, Jean. That was beautiful. Worship invites us to focus on the transcendental, the intimate, and the worthy. Worship helps us to regain our grip on the fragmented, the obsessive, and the divisive. Worship reminds us that we, empowered by the love we receive and give, may challenge any idol of greed or violence which pollutes the human condition. We ask that you bring to worship something that you want to receive, a capacity to heal, to think both critically and poetically, and to experience a growing sense of belonging, rootedness, and blessing. This was by the minister Mark Bellatini, who was a minister of the First SIUU Church of Columbus, Ohio, for 37 years. Welcome to Sky Island Unitarian Universalist Church. All are welcome here, where we strive to believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. This is where we all accept and respect one another as we each try to grow spiritually. Welcome all. Do we have any visitors here today? People that I don't know yet, which might be somebody that's been a member for 40 years.
That'd be hard since we've been around 26.
Oh, well, okay, close enough. 40's close to 26. Okay. No visitors that wish to be identified anyway? All right. Now, if you would turn and speak to the person sitting close to you and say hi. Say more than hi. Say welcome. Good morning. Glad you're here. Okay, now if you would all kind of stand or turn and wave at the folks out on Zoom. How many are out there?
8, I
Eight,
think.
including my dear husband out there. Okay. All right.
I counted wrong. I think it's 8.
Yeah. I bet they wish they were here in person. I think that the most breathtaking natural event I ever saw was back in the 90s. We happened to be at Niagara Falls on the day that the ice broke on Lake Erie. And there were chunks of ice going over the falls that were bigger than cars and refrigerators. Just great. The next day we went back and there was nothing but little bitty chunks, just little, pieces like this. But that was awesome, watching big chunks of ice from Lake Erie, and they were gone. So Mother Nature knows what she's doing. Okay, now it's time for a stewardship moment, and I believe our Mr. Jerry Beal will come forward and talk to you about giving us money, honey.
Maybe not. My wife and I came to this church to find like-minded people. We lived south of town. I couldn't find any friends in that right-sided area. I was conned by the then minister to join the stewardship committee. I've been a member ever since. This led me to the board of trustees, which I served for 8 years, which is the bylaws limit. I'm on my second year after taking a year's sabbatical. This is also stewardship. It makes me feel good to do this, and I do this because this is my emotional home. I feel welcome here, as I hope you all do. This is hard for me to say, but we have a solid minister.
Yeah, she gained a few pounds during COVID.
Well, I didn't mean that kind of solid. And Sky Island is moving forward. So let's get behind the movement and contribute what we can. There are job openings for the work that needs to be done. This is a time, talent, and treasure thing. This is so we can step into tomorrow together. Thank you.
Okay. Now joys and sorrows. Are there any joys or sorrows back there? Thank you. Okay. Gary has a joy. My joy is that it is warm enough to wear shorts. Gotcha on that one. And Richard Spencer, the Arizona Wildcat men's basketball team defeated UCLA Bruins in a nail-biting finish 59-61 to win the Pac-12 tournament last night in Las Vegas. Very good. You got one?
No, it's just that I don't think the choice is sorry.
And Wednesday is World Contact Day. It is a day to concentrate on the message of welcome and welcome to extraterrestrial visitors. Okay, all right. Might as well meet some friends. That would be a Canadian. You got it.
He's back there.
Yes, I'm observing. I'm observing. Do you have others that you
I
want?
do. I have a couple. I have a joy, and I almost made a slide of it, Susie. Is it okay if I let them know what we did on Wednesday? I almost had a slide of her with Frina. We went to see Frina, a church member who has published a lot about dementia and memory loss and has enough wherewithal to laugh at the irony that she now has it. But there's a book that she's published many books, but one of them has Susie on the cover. And when we walked in to see Frina on Wednesday, she said, "You're on the cover of my book," and she found the book. And I almost put the picture up here so you could see them now and then, as they were, how many years ago, right? It was a beautiful. The other thing, I have another joy, which is I was going to put up a slide of Jim and Howard holding my friend's 3 dogs, and then my friend holding her dogs. A few years ago, she was in life care, and I'd bring them one at a time to sit outside of life care on her lap. But I thank you for having done that, taking in 3 old dogs and many others. They are an old dog's home. And there's a concern from Amy Carter. She let me know yesterday of her neighbor died, leaving 2 lovely 3-year-old kitties. And she's hoping to find a home for them together. If you want to see pictures, I have some. They're indoor cats, they're spayed, they're adorable, they're siblings. So, and the daughter is leaving them through next Saturday, so I'm going to reach out to everyone I know. I thought I'd start with all of you, but they seem like really nice kitties. But so that is obviously a sorrow that Amy lost her neighbor, a hope to find a new home for her cats. And are there any other?
I think we're a covenantal community, and as such, we do our best to support each other in good times and bad. We gain strength by sharing our sorrows and radiate happiness when we share our joys. We've already given these. We would like to put in a stone for extraterrestrials, for wearing shorts, and for the basketball team. And then we want to give a joy for Susie Fawcett and Tina's visit to Frina. And then the fact that we have dog lovers back there that are taking care of dogs. And then a sorrow for Amy Carter's loss of her friend. And then I will also add a few more stones for all of the joys and sorrows that are not being spoken at this time, but that we carry in our hearts.
I told you that story, and I kept most of it in because I wanted you to savor the experience of Henry the bear walking through the woods, finding honey, pressing flowers, rolling in blackberries, and cultivating his soul. All of the Transcendentalists, in different ways, put that at the center of all they did. It was important to cultivate our soul. Last week, thanks to Chris Smith, we spent an evening with Margaret Fuller, and Margaret Fuller said, the purpose of life is to grow, to cultivate our souls. And Transcendentalism, as I started to look at it this week, it reminds me of when I lived in Russia and I forgot my Russian. I'd learned it at 4 and spent 3 more years there not speaking it very often. I went to high school in Concord, Massachusetts. I studied the Romantics, but I didn't study Transcendentalism. For how many is it kind of a big, weird word? How about, German idealists? Is that a big, weird expression? Right. All the things I had to go through to try to understand this seem kind of big and scary, but eventually I realized how much it speaks to my experience, and I think to all of us in this church, and so much of what we do. It's like the air we breathe. We don't recognize anymore the particles floating in it sometimes. The ideas of these Transcendentalists did not start in the 1830s and end at the beginning or end of the Civil War, They're still part of us, especially. And they offer us at least two things: a spirituality and a drive for social change. Even though a lot of what they did turned inward, it pushed them out into the world to make a difference. So this week I thought I'd remind ourselves of forms of spirituality that are still part of who we are, part of our inheritance. We do have identity, we do have spirituality. We may forget that, but it's there. And next week I'm going to talk more about the social change that those transcendentalists helped push forward in our country before, during, and after the Civil War. I'm going to begin by talking again about that idea of the oversoul, of connecting with who we are. The Transcendentalists started meeting in, I think it was 1836. The name comes from a group started by Frederick Hedge, and he wrote to his friends, and he said, I'd like a group of like-minded, not thinking alike, but, sharing a similar idea of the soul, to get together and meet. And he invited Emerson, he invited many people, and over the course of the 4 years they met, 150 different people, including a lot of women like Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Peabody, met at different places around the Boston area. Newsflash, Transcendentalism doesn't just come out of Concord, Massachusetts. There are probably two reasons we think that. Everyone read Emerson and Thoreau in high school, right? Except for me, as I lived there. But we all know a little of it, right? We think of the great literary work of those two especially, and they were from Concord. And Concord is still more rural and still has more historic spots preserved. So you can go and see where Hawthorne lived. And I lived in a room where Louisa May Alcott's sister had painted a picture, because the Alcotts lived in multiple houses in Concord because they didn't have a lot of money. Bronson Alcott started this amazing school, and he was basically teaching OWL in the early 19th century, the Our Whole Lives curriculum. When kids would ask about biology and childbirth, he was honest with them, and he was declared obscene, and they shut down the school. But his theories were that children, you pull out of them, you educare what's already in them. You value their inner soul and their growth. You don't impose something from the outside. So this group originally was called Hedge's Group because the Reverend Frederick Hedge started it, and he was serving a church in Bangor, Maine. So whenever he came to Boston, they'd meet. And many critics labeled them transcendental because, as a bad word, because they were interested in German philosophers. But several things came together to make this revival happen. It was a moral and spiritual renewal of Unitarianism, and it is still going on today. It is a huge shift in how we see faith and religion and human beings, and it still influences who we are. So this group of people who became Transcendentalists were Unitarian. That revolution had happened a generation before. Their grandparents had been in the Revolutionary War. Emerson's grandfather had watched what was happening at the bridge in Concord, and another had his grandfather fighting in Lexington. They'd been exciting people, but their parents were very materialistic, very successful, and did not want to shake those who gave money to the church, many of whom made their money in mills using cotton, and we know how cotton was raised, right? So some of the Transcendentalists saw a huge moral flaw in their churches. When Charles Fallon, who was a German, who'd come over from Germany, taught German and taught about the German idealists, and really infused ideas into young Unitarian ministers. He became an abolitionist. He stood up against slavery. He kept losing pulpits. And when he died on a steamboat fire, heading off to do a candidating sermon, his friend William Ellery Channing was not allowed to do the service in his own church. And the trustees met behind his back. First they said yes, and then they got together, no, we'd upset too many people benefiting from the slave trade. And so they would not allow him to do the service for his friend in his own church. And he wrote to the board a really clever letter. He said, okay, it seems that money's the issue. I'll continue to be your senior minister if you want me. You just don't have to pay me anymore. And they didn't get rid of him. He was too well known. But so, church politics have been going on forever, as we know. I just thought I'd throw that out there. So there was this big moral issue that the young ministers could not abide. They also discovered that churches would be located near the seashore in port towns where there was prostitution and homelessness and penury. Think of Charles Dickens' England, right? And the churches were doing nothing to address that. And there was a great spiritual aridity. There were a lot of changes happening in the life of the church. There was this movement in Germany to study the Bible like it's a historical document, like the books of the Bible are all different and written in different ways, and you should wrestle with them. Maybe they aren't exactly the Word of God. Maybe other groups have ideas we could learn from. They were starting to learn from Eastern religions. And Ralph Waldo Emerson's older brother, William, went off to Germany to learn about this biblical criticism and came back and studied law. He'd lost his sense of calling. He couldn't be a minister. These books make no sense. Where do I find revelation? So all of us are we all need some way to know what we believe is solid, right? Most of us, I think, rely on reason and science. Raise your hands if you, right? Some of us probably read people we trust, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi, or how many of us do that, right? How many of us have had a direct experience that feels awe-inspiring, or you just feel for a second like you're connected to something bigger than yourself? Has that happened to anyone here? Yeah. It happened to me after taking exams. I was in this trance, and I connected with all the trees around me because I hadn't slept in 3 days, but it was a very powerful experience. And so in this time period, they were struggling to understand what made sense, what could guide them. Clearly, Scripture was flawed and not the perfect Word of God you could stand on to guide you. You could look afield to other wisdom traditions, and you could look inside yourself. All of these people cultivating their soul meant experiencing a flash of something that connected them to something bigger. Earlier, we were reading about having a critical mind and a poetic mind. One of the authors I have been looking to this week, Barry Andrews, says he compares it to recent beliefs about the left side and the right side of the brain. I know there may be questions about whether that's biologically true, but it's a good metaphor, right? We have this left side that's verbal and thinks critically and thinks sequentially and breaks things apart. And then we have this right side, supposedly, that is poetic, that has these flashes of intuition and understanding that connects us to something larger. But all of them thought, like the German idealists, that ideas come from inside us. When we look at the world, don't we impose things on it? We don't actually see colors. There are many things we can't hear or taste or smell. We create the world more than we realize, right? And these transcendentalists were aware of that as they communed with nature, it wasn't just something external. They were having a momentary flash that didn't last long. You know, how long do we remember that feeling we had at the Grand Canyon? Or for me, I imposed my, where I have my most mystical experiences lately, which is in the Chiricahuas. You may have other spots that you go to where you have that sense of wonder and awe and being part of something bigger. And that's the type of religion the Transcendentalists were calling forth and looking for. It's part of who we are, though. Because if you believe that every person has that possibility, you start to believe in our first principle, in the worth and dignity of every human being, maybe every sentient being, right? This is how they became a force for social change. Because if every human being has that, how can you not educate women? None of those women transcendentalists could go to college, right? And yet had gotten educated. How could you not educate the working classes? Horace Mann, who was part of this, who married into this, worked very hard to start the public school system because human beings deserve education. And how can you own another human being? So many of them became, if not calling themselves abolitionists, anti-slavery and wanting to find a way to end it. If not immediately, very quickly. Coming out of that belief that every individual has this sacred connection to something larger, we are pushed to value that. So I'm going to talk a tiny bit about the spiritual traditions that they offer us, that we probably already do, that were big with Transcendentalists and are still part of our lives, that Barry Andrews and John Behrens, who was the president of the UUA, believe Transcendentalism is still alive now, can still speak to us. And as Behrens says, this began in the 1830s when there was a huge recession and depression in the US. He says that we as Unitarians are at our best in crisis. We flourished up to the beginning and maybe through the Civil War. That was our high water mark, at least as Unitarians. And right now, do we live in comfortable, easy times? Somewhat, but yeah, there are crises, right? And that there are truths from our past that might speak to us now. So one of the spiritual disciplines that they did was just taking time to reflect and renew themselves every day. Ralph Waldo Emerson sat in his study for 3 hours every morning before he did something else. If I did that, my son wouldn't get food and go to school. But, you know, and he took time to write in a journal. Does anyone here keep a journal? Wow, that's impressive. Yeah. Barron says he keeps a journal because it helps him be honest with himself. When he's been sour and missed church meetings because he doesn't want to show his bad mood in public, journaling can help him understand why and where and who he is. So I never have time for it. I think it's a great idea to meditate, to journal, to do those things. By the end of his life, Henry Thoreau stopped seeing himself as Christian. He saw himself as somewhat Buddhist. Some of the writers say they probably wouldn't admit to him, but he meditated and he reflected and he read their literature, and it changed him every day. They also talk about conversation as a spiritual discipline. So when Margaret Fuller, who couldn't preach publicly because she was a woman and couldn't be, educated publicly, but could speak Latin and Greek better than any of the people her age trying to get into Harvard, needing to speak Latin and Greek and being male, she had to have conversations in Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore in Boston. And they were conversations mostly with the wives of other Transcendentalist ministers or well-to-do people in Boston. But she pushed them to think about, is it good to be passive? Should you have agency in your own lives? They had conversations and really began the feminist movement in the United States. I'm glad to see that we continue that tradition every Sunday at 1 o'clock with the Freethinkers. If you've never attended, it gets pretty wild. But there are conversations, again, of people who might not think alike, but come with a similar spirit to discuss and value each other's opinions. Another thing they did was have spiritual friendships. I love this answer to the question, can men and women be friends? Can you be friends with someone of a sex you're attracted to? Heck yes. And their spiritual friendships crossed class, gender, race, and they, according to Barron's, they actually sought out people who were quite different. People who would challenge them, but care for them. Sounds like my household with my husband and me. Somebody who you love and you care about, but doesn't actually believe or understand everything the same way. Do you think that might help us today if we sought out those kinds of friendships? If we could find a safety, feel cared for, to then discuss how different we are. I think that's the only way we can transform what's happening. I don't see exactly how to do it, but it's huge. Frederick Douglass and Theodore Parker, who was a very important Unitarian and Transcendentalist theologian, were such good friends that when Parker died in Rome, 27 years later, Frederick Douglass came to be there on the anniversary of his death, to visit his grave, and discovered how it was an inadequate stone. Douglass said, I don't really believe in building big mausoleums over the dead, but this guy deserves more. And so he commissioned someone to put up a really nice stone about how Parker had written on our hearts. Last week we heard about Margaret Fuller. She was a really good friend with Thomas Freeman Clark, an early minister, transcendentalist. They were about 20 years old when they really struggled to learn German together. And they talked to each other constantly. Even if they couldn't get on Zoom, how did these people communicate constantly? Letters. They wrote many, many beautiful confrontational letters to each other. Barron's quotes Elizabeth Peabody. She wrote to the mayor of Boston saying, why did you send me your niece? She is lazy. She does not speak her mind. She has no thoughts that she's willing to share. It's as if you've decided she should be passive and sit in the corner, as young women were taught in 1830s, right? So they wrote these letters to each other and challenged each other, and they did this all their lives. One writer thinks that Clark and Fuller decided that Fuller wouldn't make a good minister's wife. She would have made a good minister. So they didn't marry. Their closeness was never that intimate. But all their lives, they wrote to each other until she died in the shipwreck we heard about last week. These people had powerful, challenging, caring friendships as a spiritual discipline. And I think it encourages all of us to do something similar. And Barry Andrews speaks about teaching as a spiritual discipline. He does a beautiful sermon about teaching religious education in Unitarian Universalist churches. And he basically says what Bronson Alcott said. It's more important that you bring your soul and all of yourself to teaching. It's less important that you feed into these people the truths, the path they're supposed to go. It's important to be there with them on the journey, to help them remember inside themselves their connection to the divine, who they are, their sense of wonder, a sense of compassion. And you as a teacher need to model that. I had an experience teaching Sunday school. A friend of mine and I, she was about to preach, and I was going to teach Sunday school, and we really wished we could swap. Because the week before, this was in a Christian, it was in a UCC church, the kids had said to me, "Why did they kill Jesus? And how do you really, honestly, lovingly answer 6-year-olds?" I basically said, because they were stupid. But, but walking with them in an authentic way out of what I believe, in a way that wouldn't necessarily traumatize them for life, that's an interesting challenge. Showing up with your whole soul. I invite us all to do that every week and with everyone we're with. I know many of our encounters have to be protected and guarded, right? But I've discovered with people I know and love, and don't vote the right way at my work, hospice, we can have these powerful, loving conversations out of who we are. I think I've told you that in 2016, when I came to work very upset, my boss was celebrating, and I explained to her why I was upset. She said, "Oh, what you say about Trump is what we believed about Obama." And it put a little crack in her thinking, out of her heart, and out of her sense of me as a person of integrity and worth, connected at some level to the divine. She could start to hear a little tiny bit. So I encourage all of us, when we teach, or when we talk, or when we think, or when we meditate, or when we journal, or when we walk in this beautiful countryside we're part of, to remember in flashes that we are connected to something bigger, to each other, to the sacred, in whatever way you name it. Thank you.
We are here dedicated to the proposition that beneath all our differences, behind all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together, in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. We pause in silent witness to that unity. This is from the minister David Brumbaugh, who is an emeritus minister from New Jersey UU. And now if you'll sit and listen to Jeannie's postlude, and then we'll go eat. Very good.